of Indigenous peoples across what is now called the United States. We will be remiss in our discussion of epistemic silencing if we did not acknowledge the ways in which the production of knowledge in higher education in North America and around the world is scaffolded atop epistemic silence wrought through ontologic obliteration. This kind of silencing, the silencing that roars from colonial impulses, is linked to the stuff of today's keynote panel. What nursing chooses not to know are practices of epistemic silencing. To orient you here, each panelist will offer some remarks on the topic of epistemic silencing and its relationship to nursing. The offerings today will span a wide and disparate range of topics that are linked up through this concept of silencing. We'll then move into a discussion, linking ideas and finding shared and divergent lines of flight. This will begin as a discussion between panelists, and as we move to the conclusion of our time together, we will open dialogue to audience questions, both here and virtually. As with the previous keynote session, those in the room will need to come to the mics to ask questions, and those in Zoom land, we ask that you raise your hand and we will call on you, and you can ask your question that way, using the raise your hand function, right? Rather than like putting your hand up. My name is Jessica Dillard-Wright, and I'll be moderating this panel today. Thanks to Miriam Bender, the Center for Nursing Philosophy, and the International Philosophy of Nursing Conference for holding this space for these important conversations. It's my distinct pleasure to share the stage virtually and actually with this amazing group of thinkers and doers, which includes some of my beloved co-conspirators and nurse heroes. Collectively, the panel spans several nations and continents, though we're all speaking from colonized spaces. In thinking about epistemic silence and silencing in nursing, we're construing this concept broadly, as you will see. Dr. Claire Valderama-Wallace will touch on the structural considerations with her remarks on ecosystems of settler colonial logics of nursing, erasure, myopia, and fear. Dr. Amélie Perron's work takes on the lessons we have learned or refused, right, in these COVID times, interrogating the ways in which nurses' interests and patient interests are pitted against one another. Dr. Lucinda Canty's remarks center on the utilization of nursing scholars of color in the development of nursing knowledge. From here, the focus tightens as doctoral student Ismalia de Sousa draws on nursing history and lived experience to reflect on how historical knowing offers critical tools to understand the world of ideas and ways of knowing that nursing has and is silencing. And Dr. Janice Gullick will be speaking on the erasure of gender diverse persons in nursing scholarship. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Claire Valderama-Wallace. Where is the clicker? Thank you, Josh. Hey. Dr. Claire Valderama-Wallace, Thea, is an associate professor in the Department of Nursing at Cal State University, East Bay, where she teaches community health nursing, community engagement, and epidemiology and social inequities. She is the MSN program coordinator, co-chairs the department's Dismantling Racism in Nursing Education Task Force, and convenes the university's Indigenous Acknowledgement Collective. A vision for anti-imperialist and anti-racist futures inform her efforts in teaching, scholarship, and organizing. Her remarks are entitled Ecosystems of Settler Colonial Logics of Nursing, Erasure, Myopia, and Fear. Claire?
Thank you so much, Jess. And magandang umaga, magandang hapon, magandang gabi, depending on what time zone you're in. Greetings to everyone. As Jess said, I'm Claire. My pronouns are she and sha. And I can't speak about silencing without bringing in Audre Lorde. She said, the fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us, for it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. So I'm hoping some of those silences, as you hear that quote, come up for you and that they are reflected back here. So there's so much we could say about silencing within beyond nursing. And so for me, when I think nursing, first it was, what nursing chooses not to know. Well, how are we defining nursing? So I will say I'm defining nursing within my few minutes of remarks as nursing institutions who have the power and invest in defining nursing for others, for the rest of us, and who continue to invest in these systems where not expansive definitions of nursing are welcome. So I would say, I list here some of those narratives, and within those narratives, there are practices of violence, practices of resistance, and everything in between. So for me, I would say nursing chooses not to know or chooses to silence practices, sciences, and stances that nurture health, wholeness, and liberation. And the fact that these cannot ever be fully realized with our systems, which are built for accumulation, exploitation, and extraction. And so truly, does nursing nurture? Do we silence? Do we aid in the planting and nurturing of seeds of resistance? What are the multiplicities of possibility needed? I also think when I think of the erasure, myopia, and fear, which are central to settler colonial logics and practices, that narrow and harmful colonial notions of expertise position the masses as less than and in need of saving. And I say that with multiple degrees. I say that as an alumna of multiple UCs and institutions that are deemed respectable and respected. And so I know I say that, and it is fraught because I continue to benefit from these notions of expertise and success. And when I say the masses, I mean the vast majority of people on this planet are working class folks, are peasants, right? So yeah, and I will also say, when I think about solutions, when I think about goals, I would say the solutions needed to address the current and ongoing material conditions will not be generated in nor through global North institutions, and maybe not even in the English language. I would say working alongside the masses across these made-up borders and our diasporas against empire to create new futures will do that. And I will end by saying, nursing is not the beginning, middle, end. I invite us to think, act, and be in relation with each other in the dynamic cycles of our ecosystems. Something that, a word I don't choose to include here, but I will say now, is professionalization and profession. How has that become weaponized? For who can define what for whom? Who can define nursing for whom? Who can define health for whom? And so I'll end my time there and look forward to being in dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valderama-Wallace. Amélie Perron is a full professor at the School of Nursing at the University of Ottawa and is co-president of the Nursing Observatory. Her clinical practice is grounded in community psychiatry and crisis intervention. As a researcher, she has worked on many research projects in psychiatric nursing and forensic psychiatry in Canada, France, and Australia. Her research interests include power relationships between healthcare professionals, patients, and care settings, nursing care to captive and marginalized populations, issues of discourse, risk, and ethics, and nursing epistemology. Through her work with the Nursing Observatory, Professor Perron is more specifically interested in the socio-political aspects of care, whistleblowing in healthcare, and nurses' political action. She is the co-author of On Politics of Ignorance in Nursing and Healthcare, Knowing Ignorance, and co-edited Power and the Psychiatric Apparatus, Assistance, Repression, and Transformation, as well as Rethinking Violence in the Healthcare Setting, a Critical Approach. Professor Perron is also editor of Aporia, the nursing journal, a peer-reviewed international and bilingual French and English journal. Her work is funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council of Canada. Dr. Perron.
Hi, thanks for having me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So it's very meaningful for me to be invited as a panelist here. because it reminds me of how in May 2012, I gave my first real keynote address at the Philosophy in the Nurses World Conference, which was called the BAN Conference. And in that keynote, I explored the relevance of Foucault's notion of care of the self and its relationship with what I think are two needed dispositions in nursing: disobedience, which Eric Fromm defined as an act of affirmation of reason and agency, and parrhesia, which Michel Foucault identified as the disposition to speak freely and fearlessly. And the premise of my talk was that nurses need to care for themselves before they could care for anyone else. And of course, it's a position that is rather antithetical to the received view of devotion and selflessness in our profession, and the idea that patients must always come first. Care of the self refers to a kind of committed relationship one develops with oneself through embodied attitudes and practices. It's a manner of being, a critical attitude that problematizes discourses, norms, and rules that are mapped onto individuals and that constitute them as subjects. It implies a questioning and challenging attitude that is directed at oneself first, to critically assess and examine what one knows, but also how one came to know in the first place, why one hangs on to certain kinds of beliefs and knowledges, especially when those have proven to be harmful, and what other knowledges one might overlook or dismiss in the process. And in the keynote and publication that followed, I discussed the ethical and political implications for care of the self in nursing, and it's what I think are clear relationships with the need to speak up when a situation requires it. So to break silences and to break ignorance when they occur. 10 years later, having witnessed a decade of events that seem to promise socio-political transformations, but more probably reveal the deeper entrenchment of the status quo, I remain convinced that care of the self needs to be prioritized in nursing, both its epistemic commitments and its implications for a nursing praxis. But I can't help the thought that nursing has a very complicated relationship with critical thinking and acts of speaking up. And to me, this is surprising since we have such strong discourses of advocacy, equity, and justice in our profession. And those seem to have strengthened these past couple of years with the growing exposure of rooted systems of sanctioned violence and abuse against certain persons or certain groups, and even against nurses themselves, especially as was revealed during the pandemic. And yet critical thinking and speaking up create profound discomfort among nurses in all realms, in clinical settings, in academic spaces, in so-called leadership organizations, such as regulatory bodies and professional associations. And the reality is that nurses and nursing students who care for themselves through critical reflection and acts of speaking up continue to be ignored, dismissed, silenced, and often vilified by colleagues, educators, employers, and even by regulators. And I'm doing work on whistleblowing right now where this is very, very much coming to light. And so it leads me to think that the insights gained over the past decades and the lessons learned even as recently as during the pandemic about nurses' pivotal role in speaking up continue to be ignored, continue to be even sometimes derided and often resisted. And too many so-called nursing leaders, wherever they may be, whether they're in healthcare spaces, in industry, academic, or other circles, instead continue to embody and promote an utterly apolitical and aphilosophical kind of nursing, refusing to engage with the messiness of everyday practice when faced with complex and ever-shifting ideological systems. And what is currently perpetuated instead is an inclination towards an unsustainable mix of complacency, guilt, and fear, grounded in a view that still pins patient interests and nurse interests against each other, and that excludes insights that don't fall within the usual scripts of professionalism, employer loyalty, modesty, and heroic subservience, as we saw even during the pandemic. And those nurses who speak up for just, safe, and meaningful care, who promote pluralistic and diverse perspectives, and who embody a more assertive, more politicized, more philosophical view of nursing agency, are often made to understand that they are too negative, too political, too disruptive, insubordinate, unprofessional, or just plain attention seekers. And ignoring and silencing such individuals maintains our profession's blind spots and robs us of needed knowledge and insights into critical issues inherent in care, academic, and professionalization systems under the ideological rule of neoliberalism, patriarchy, and racism. I often wonder what nursing has to gain from this ignoring and this silencing. which has been quite normalized in our profession. Not all ignorance is created equal, and maybe it's just that sticking to a known evil is better than diving into a yet to be defined future. But perhaps there are other factors at play as well. And I think that they do deserve some reflection. As harmful as the status quo is for both patients and nurses, I wonder if nursing still benefits from it in certain ways. For example, by avoiding the discomfort and messiness of advocacy and militant work, it can uphold a very squeaky clean image of proper and professional behavior and avoid difficult and confronting discourses, confronting discussions and sometimes very challenging and uncomfortable discussions. At the same time, discourses of selflessness, heroism, and powerlessness match social expectations towards nurses. And I think that secures nursing status as a kind of darling of the public and the media. And perhaps we don't want to disrupt that imagery. Also, perhaps discourses of busyness and exhaustion can help justify a lack of engagement in social, political, and legal debates, and therefore the relinquishing of power in the hands of others. I don't know. I wonder about these factors that may be at play. But either way, the outcome is the steady obedience to unforgiving and exclusionary socioeconomic ideologies and care systems, while appearing to change those systems more than we actually are. I still believe that nursing needs to engage with the epistemic and pragmatic dimensions of care of the self, disobedience, and parrhesia through individual and networked dialogues, at the very least to interrupt its participation in processes of obfuscation that make unjust or unsafe healthcare realities opaque or even invisible. Officially adopting current discourses of justice, equity, social change, and plurality without first questioning their epistemic underpinnings, without questioning what we actually mean by them and what they require of us, both philosophically and politically, and without problematizing the multiple ways in which we also silence those discourses in everyday conversation, in clinical practice, in education, through curricula, even in policy. What that means, I think, is that we will not accomplish what we aim and what we claim to do. At best, nursing will miss out on steering the changes that we want to see happen. But at worst, it may mean that nursing will participate in what sociologist Lindsay McGooey calls charismatic violence, a mechanism by which certain people or groups, for example, nurses, position themselves as transformational agents of change while functioning in practice as vanguards of an injurious status quo. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perron. I think it's interesting that Dr. Valderama-Wallace touched on Audre Lorde and that you're speaking to care of the self, which puts me in mind of self-care and draws on Audre Lorde, talking about the self-care as an act of political warfare. It's not something benign. It's not a pedicure. It's being fearless and speaking up. Thank you so much. Dr. Canty is an associate professor and director of the SeedWorks Health Equity Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Lucinda, Dr. Canty is a certified nurse midwife and provides women's health care at Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. Her research interests include the prevention of maternal mortality and severe maternal morbidity, reducing racial and ethnic health disparities in reproductive health, promoting diversity in nursing, and eliminating racism in nursing. She is an artist, poet, and historian, and she is also a fellow in the American College of Nurse Midwives. Dr. Canty?
Thank you. So who produces and transmits knowledge for nursing and understanding of the discipline of nursing? Nursing chooses not to know why there's a lack of diversity and inclusion in the development of nursing knowledge. Nursing chooses not to know or acknowledge the contributions of nursing scholars of color or the challenges that nursing scholars of color experience. The power lies in who produces and translates the knowledge. Those who have power struggle to understand the struggle of those who do not have the power, and this results in silence. From the emancipatory knowing standpoint, we need to critically examine why there's a lack of diversity and inclusion And why does this lack of diversity and inclusion exist? And why does it continue to exist? Because there's nothing new. Who benefits from the knowledge? Who has been harmed by it? What are the structures that perpetuate the silencing of nursing scholars of color? I would like you to consider, what do institutions do to support predominantly hegemonic knowledge from a dominant culture of white nurse scholars? How do universities, research literature, and journals support dominant white scholarship in nursing? We need to identify and bring to awareness to these structures. Nursing refuses to see or believe there are environments that create challenges for nursing scholars of color. And I feel that this epistemic silencing starts with nursing education from undergraduate to postdoctorate level. Invisibility of nurses of color, nurse scholars, nurse researchers in the nursing curriculum. White nurses are seen as the authoritative figure, even in issues that relate to people of color. We have to challenge that. And again, going back to those who are just training and learning and want to be scholars, who want to do research, who want to have philosophical conversations about what they experience in nursing. They experience the most difficult challenges. And I'm particularly talking about doctoral students of color. They're in environments where there are assumptions that students of color want to be like their white counterparts. Lack of advisement or mentoring of young nursing scholars. And that was my experience. White faculty lacking the interest of cultural issues or not understanding them. And just when you're thinking of, because when you're working on your doctorate degree, as we all know, is very challenging. But when you're in an environment where you're unsupported, you're dealing with additional barriers. Not only how do I get together, the methodology for my study, but is my advisor going to understand? Are they going to be a barrier that creates further problems for me? And one of the most difficult things is feeling like your research is devalued. And that was my experience. Dealing with addressing reproductive health disparities, addressing Black maternal health and how we're 3 to 4 times more likely to die, and wanting to do something to address that. I was made to feel like that wasn't important. Not until I started to be acknowledged after I graduated. And then someone comes to me who was not very supportive and wants to write, do you need help with your manuscripts? I was like, no, thank you. I moved on. I graduated now, so I don't have to listen to anything that you have to say. But one thing is being a student, in a doctoral program, one of the most challenging things was just being seen and heard, and the fight that I had to do that. And I had to take almost a breaking point where either I quit and then I'm silenced, or do I fight for what I believe in? And instead of having that question, you know how you're preparing your research or you're talking to your advisor, how many of you have heard, is it fundable? What about my research is to try to save lives, which is to provide better care for those who are most vulnerable. So I just bring that up because I feel like that's where it starts, but it continues after graduation, where you feel like, you're a scholar, you made it. I remember like yesterday, and I graduated during COVID. I just barely made it. And I have to share with you, my advisor wanted me to present after spring break of 2020. And I had to fight to defend on February 24th. If I would have waited till after spring break, I would still be in school right now. Because can you imagine the challenges that I would have had to experience? So I think that for nursing researchers of color, we just want to have spaces where we can have philosophical discourse, spaces where we, again, could be seen and heard, where we feel valued, our contributions to nursing are recognized. We need spaces where we feel like we belong. And that's one of the challenges I still experience, even though I have presented all over the United States, virtually, but still all over the United States. But still is that constant struggle of trying to show people that I deserve to be here, where I see others who do half the work, who are self-seeking, and they get more recognition than I get. So it just has to change. It has to change. And for us to decolonize nursing knowledge, We have to question and challenge our assumptions. We cannot decolonize nursing knowledge until we question the assumptions that are not informed by those who are most oppressed. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Canty. I'm just struck by how many connections I'm seeing between all of the comments everyone has here today, and in particular, the idea of refusal, right? That's something that struck me about your remarks. Ismalia de Sousa is a doctoral student at the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Before beginning her doctoral studies, de Sousa worked in London as a registered nurse and later as a clinical nurse specialist in stroke. Her research and teaching philosophy is informed by critical theory, particularly Black and Chicana feminisms and post-colonial theory. De Sousa's research interests include health inequities in stroke care, stroke survivorship, critical pedagogy, and Black nurses' history.
Thank you, Dr. Dillard-Wright. I hope you can hear me well. As a PhD student and someone relatively new to the world of nursing philosophy, it is an absolute privilege to be joining you all on this panel and to be learning from all of you. Today, I'm coming to this space from the unceded ancestral and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, what we now know as Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. I'm a Black woman with dark brown hair and a fringe, wearing a light blue top, and I'm sitting on a white background that also appears blurred. And when I was invited to speak at this panel and comment on what nursing chooses not to know, its practices of epistemic silence and silencing, I was sure I wanted to draw from my lived experience as a Black European, specifically a first-generation Afro-Portuguese whose first language isn't English, my experience living in Portugal, Finland, and the United Kingdom, and more recently, my experience during my PhD program and the learnings I have gained from the collective discourses as a community of scholars, including students here at University of British Columbia in Canada. And drawing from my lived experience was a political choice. Since beginning my doctoral studies, I have realized that nursing philosophy is often written by and to white women who often draw on the philosophy of white men and rarely on lived experience theorizing as a point of departure. The philosophy that builds from the lived experiences of nurses of color, such as, but not only, Black, Indigenous, Chicano, Chicanx, is mostly absent in the canon of nursing theorizing. For instance, Black feminist thought and Chicana feminism as important models of thinking for nursing praxis are seldom referred to in the titles of or abstracts of English academic nursing journals. So this opening remark reflects what I have come to know as a result of my lived experience as a Black cis woman and nurse in the global North, and how history has offered me a way to understand the foundations of Western white Eurocentric nursing philosophy and Western white Eurocentric nursing writ large. In an editorial written in 2016 and entitled PhD Without a PH, Dr. Sally Thorne underscored the lack of doctorally prepared nurses with sufficient knowledge about the philosophy of science as a result of curriculums favoring an intensive research method-centered training. Dr. Thorne argued that this lack of attention to the philosophical underpinnings of nursing as an applied science was deeply problematic. I would like to extend Dr. Thorne's claim that doctoral nursing education necessitates engagement with the philosophy of nursing science and the history of theoretical thinking, and argue that undergraduate and graduate nursing education also warrant critical engagement and reflection on nursing history in order to develop a more fulsome understanding both of nursing philosophy and the history of nursing's theoretical thinking. Colonialism, coloniality, and chattel slavery explain the politics of exclusion and epistemic erasure of Black and Indigenous ways of knowing, and today's lack of representation of Black and Indigenous nurses in senior leadership positions in countries with a long, and in some cases, unresolved history with and of colonialism. Yet I spent 10 years as a registered nurse before commencing my doctoral program and aware of how colonialism and chattel slavery shaped and continue to shape nursing and the development of nursing knowledge. During my 4 undergraduate degree years in Portugal, a country that I should remind the audience started the transatlantic slave trade and was one of the longest European empires, white women were the beginning and end point of nursing theory and nursing history. And fast forward, during my 3 years in a Masters of Science program in the United Kingdom, another European colonial power, nursing theory and philosophy were absent from the program. So I ask why? What does this tell us if white women were the beginning and end point of nursing theory and nursing history? If nursing theory and philosophy were absent from my master's program, could there be something nursing is trying to hide? Is it that nursing has deliberately chosen this? Is this a practice of epistemic silence and silencing that nursing chose not to know, as the title of this panel asks us to reflect? I do wonder if there is a different way in which we should be asking this question. By asking what nursing chooses not to know, its practices of ontological and epistemological silence and silencing, we may fall into thinking that because there is something that is not being told, then that something needs to be included. This practice of inclusionary othering resembles equity, diversity, and inclusion that ultimately tell us that there was a project constructed, but it was never for certain people and groups, specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or Black and minority ethnic groups, as we know in Europe. Perhaps we should not be asking ourselves what nursing chooses not to know, and the epistemes of silence and silencing, but what nursing chooses to protect. And to answer this question, I believe that historical knowing offers us, as it has offered me, a critical tool to understand the world of ideas and ways of knowing that nursing has chosen to protect. During my PhD program, I conducted historical research to examine the history and visibility of Black nurses in British Columbia between 1845 and 1910. My particular interest was the end of the 19th century, which coincided with the arrival of the first Black settlers in British Columbia. Conducting historical research work meant not only unearthing the names, lives, and work of Black nurses in British Columbia and understanding their contributions to healthcare, but also developing an understanding of the socio-political and economic landscape in British Columbia, Canada, and the world. And of course, a true appreciation for the work of historians. Indeed, many early Black settlers in British Columbia and Black nurses were either born into slavery or one of the first generations of free people who fled the West because of Jim Crow laws. The end of the 19th century, which I examined in this historical work, also marked the beginning of nursing schools and Nightingale apprenticeship training. So nursing became a privileged profession for white women of respectable socioeconomic class. The good nurse was heterosexual and embodied feminine virtues, pure, devoted to the male, gentle, and caring. And these gender stereotypes intersecting with racist ideologies place Black women at the margins. By racist ideologies, I am referring to colonialism and chattel slavery. Colonial expansionism and chattel slavery were the vehicles that define what was human, non-human, and animal by and for the white European man. As Black philosophers Zakiya and Iman Jackson remind us, in the first encounters with primates in Africa during colonialism, white European men built the assumptions that the African body held similarities with such animals, which led to the proliferation of animalizing discourses, meaning that the African body and its associated Blackness were, and I quote, the animal in the form of a human, end quote. And so, if the African was the animal in the form of human, they could not be rational beings, and thus could not think. They were objects, non-beings, ontological zeros, and inferior to humans. Colonialism and chattel slavery then upheld and maintained these ontological and epistemological and also physical violences by objectifying and continue to construct the Black body as, quote, an animal in the form of a human. And so, if Black people are intellectually inferior, if they are ontological zeros, their education is a criminal act, using here the words of Black historian Jarvis Givens. At the end of the 19th century, these ideological currents that underlay anti-Blackness and also anti-indigeneity, combined with gender stereotypes of who is a nurse, and I remind us, white, middle class, explain the exclusion of Black and Indigenous people's knowledges, and as a result, Black feminist thought, Indigenous ways of knowing, Chicana feminism. These sentiments have permeated nursing and nursing philosophy for centuries, and these are the sentiments that prevail. So I want to return to my earlier question. What does nursing choose to protect? I believe that there is a simple answer. Nursing has chosen and continues to protect whiteness and white privilege. And our investment in constructing a new or renewed nursing philosophy cannot simply acknowledge what we have chosen not to know and to silence if we will never learn and sit with the discomfort about what we've always protected. And so I end my remarks by asking the audience to reflect not on what nursing has continued to silence, but on what else nursing continues to protect. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Dr. Janice Gullick is an associate professor at the Susan Wakil School of Nursing and Midwifery, University of Sydney, where she teaches assessment and clinical judgment and illness experience in the postgraduate advanced studies and graduate entry masters of nursing programs. Dr. Gullick is a qualitative researcher and a Heideggerian scholar, undertaking a body of work that explores the application of discrete elements of existential philosophy as an analytic framework for nursing research. She is the director of the International Collaboration of Nurse Scholars, ICONS, a body that holds biennial PhD summer schools across 8 countries. Her remarks, which narrow to considerations of the nurse care recipient dyad, is titled The Erasure of Gender Diverse Persons in Nursing Scholarship. Dr. Gullick.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'm coming to you from the Bidjigal people of the Darug Nation, the lands of the Bidjigal people, from Sydney, Australia. In the words of Mary Feather and Bruce, to be rendered invisible is one of the most emotionally painful experiences possible. I came to this discourse back in 2019. I was really grateful when 2 of my pre-registration nursing students asked for greater attention in the curriculum to caring and communicating for people who are gender diverse. And in searching for relevant literature, with the exception of a discursive paper that noted that invisibility of the issue in nursing scholarship, there was really little to be found. And to find relevant discussions about practice issues for nurses in caring for gender diverse people, I had to draw on the research of other health professions, such as social work and radiography. But I have to say that sort of scholarship was also scant. In my course that explores illness experiences, theories of the body and society, and therapeutic communication, I saw an opportunity to explore what nursing care could look like for people either living with gender dysphoria or expressing a gender identity that might differ from their sex at birth. For people who are gender diverse, their erasure is structural. We know that women's shelters may not take in trans women fleeing domestic violence. Many countries will not fund gender-affirming medical treatment. Some prisons and hospitals only recognise one's sex at birth. And the media, rather than highlighting issues of social justice, often focus on divisive topics such as trans people's participation in gendered sport or the framing of parents' support of their child's gender identity as abuse. In academia, research supporting gender-affirming care is underfunded, and in the development of government policies, gender diverse people are often not consulted. Of course, many nurses were raised and educated or still practice in societies where one's gender is under state control. So mostly using cross-dressing laws, 13 countries criminalise transgender people, while in 47 UN member states, it's not possible to legally change your gender. And even where gender diverse people are protected by law, in Foucauldian logic, we know that power is not reliant on state control. Nurses, nurse educators, and patients are the product of complex power mechanisms that create docile bodies for whom freedom is present, but always with constraints. And so we find that social identity is essentialized by compelling people to fit within binary gender expressions. And then under the examination of the medical gaze, and that's a gaze in which nurses participate, gender diverse people defy classification and they instead fall into the role of deviant. Because of their perceived deviance, transgender people face stigma and discrimination. If we use a lens of Goffman's stigma theory, in the eyes of normals, transgender people may transgress all three of Goffman's stigma categories, perceived as exhibiting blemishes of character, abominations of the body, while their identification with a queer community may open them to tribal stigma. And so this enacted and felt stigma results in bullying and hate crimes, difficulty accessing appropriate healthcare and insurance, and higher rates of mental ill health and suicide. I guess the thing is that nurses who care for transgender people are as likely as any other group to feel unsettled by this gender nonconformity, as trans people may exist on the boundaries of what nurses may see as clean, proper, moral, or definable. So part of the theoretical and political usefulness of queer and transgender theory, and the plus at the end of LGBTQI, is the inherent resistance to definition and classification. We might find, though, that some nurses, in an attempt to shore up the boundaries of their own identity, may then see the gender diverse person as what Christeva would describe as abject. The absence of affirmation for gender diverse people was perhaps first described as erasure by sociologist Vivienne Namaste in 2000. And then in 2014, Mary Feather and Bruce applied this idea of erasure to nursing scholarship, illuminating the silencing power of dominant discourses and the resulting lack of preparation for nurses to understand and to care for people who are gender diverse. And they proposed 4 discourses relevant to this invisibility and erasure. The first described micro and macro aggressions that range from a lack of inclusive vocabulary, such as preferred names and pronouns, through to refusal of care and even emotional and verbal abuse. The second discourse, that of nurses advocate for marginalised and underserviced populations, noted the absence of trans people in these scholarly discussions. And of course, that has led to the deprioritisation of related research. The third discourse, that of cultural competence, was found to be restricted to race and ethnicity, with the trans community rarely identified as a culture in itself. And so there's a subsequent lack of a firm theoretical basis for the cultural safety that such a discourse could support for gender diverse people. And then finally, emancipatory discourses were described for their potential to counter erasure through their focus on social justice, anti-oppression, and the social determinants of health. While it's important for nurses to appreciate these challenges for gender diverse people, I think to only see them through a lens of victimhood presents a further erasure. In a 2013 thesis, social worker Barb Burge presents a phenomenology of transgenderism as a valued life experience. Having been deprived of their true self for so long, she states, these trans people described a new sense of integrity where their inner and outer selves were finally aligned, and their sense of difference opened up a newfound freedom where they could imagine new possibilities for being human, including ways to overcome arbitrary gender roles and expectations. So in the past 2 years, since I first started to explore the literature, it's been pleasing to see an emerging body of nurse scholarship. Christopher Gilbert's Nursing Considerations for Transgender Men, Nyan Anderson's 2021 article on practical considerations of gender-affirming care for novice nurses, and Ziegler and colleagues' development of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Toolkit for nurses and educators. As a heteronormative cis woman, I can't stand for gender diverse people, but I can certainly stand with them. And that means rather than benign tolerance and individual acceptance, finding a way to proactively work within my sphere of influence as an academic and educator to normalise gender diversity, to promote student access to lived experience, and to build cultural competence for gender affirming care. And in doing so, I invite you to strive to be what a participant of Burge's research would describe as real people. So be people who are willing to learn, be willing to be educated, and be willing to admit that you don't have all the answers. Be intellectually curious. Gender diverse people have always deserved to feel of equal value and are now expecting validation and respect as basic indicators of dignity and belonging. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Gullick. So now we're going to enter into a time of conversation amongst the panelists, and then following that, we'll invite some questions from the audience. I want to take a moment to appreciate D'Souza's reframing of this question and thinking about the question of silence versus the question of protection, right? I think that there's ways in which there is this active project of protecting and refusing, right? Refusing to see things that are clear. And I see connections that link all of these disparate ideas that we've heard from today, from these people today. And so it really puts me in mind of Black feminist luminary and poet Audre Lorde again, right? And in the essay entitled "The Uses of Anger," Lorde wrote, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." And I think we've talked about a lot of different kinds of things in our conversation today. And I think that this kind of resonates for me in a number of different ways in the context of these collective comments. So this leads me to some questions. And the first is the notion that our collective present futures are inextricably bound. And Ismalia, I may actually have some specific questions for you around history, since I think actually our present future is tied with our history as well. So if you wanted to take this on, that would be wonderful. But given the disparate ways in which we've considered epistemic silence or silencing, how do you see these acts as connected? So I open that to anyone, even though I named you specifically.
And it's okay, I can start. That's not a problem. As I was listening to Dr. Gullick and Dr. Canty, Dr. Perron, I was really thinking about this idea of coloniality and the kinds of knowledge that arise from colonialism. And I really think that's at least one of the wires that connects these silences, or that protects these silences. When Dr. Gullick was talking about the erasure of scholarship focused on transgender and gender diverse people, I'm thinking about it as an explicit othering practice, right? On how we see the world constructed as us versus them. And if I see the person sitting next to me as different from myself, if I believe that my identity and my experiences are not constructed in relation and interaction with those around me, if I don't see that interconnectivity, then I'm more likely to believe that I'm not like them, that I need to protect myself from them. And therefore their knowledges, their experiences are not worth it. And I am not going to invest my time in studying, for example. So I really do see, when you ask about history, I really see this continuous thread about coloniality present here. And as Dr. Perron was talking about the apolitical and aphilosophical kind of nursing, and I think, Dr. Perron, you did mention this, you did talk about this in your remarks, the connection with how nursing has been constructed as a profession historically, how the good nurse has been constructed with specific ideals of devotion, and devotion being to doctors. And I was reflecting on the apprenticeship training and the role of nurses at that time, primarily to staff hospitals. And if you think about hospitals as operating within the biomedical model, so could it be that by deciding to be apolitical, we are upholding and protecting that exact biomedical model, and we're fearful of losing power, of losing privilege, of not being seen as a respectable profession? So I'll leave it as that. I hope that answers part of your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Would anyone like to respond?
I'm happy to add to what Ismalia was saying, and I think that I think she's absolutely right in the sense that in thinking about what nursing is trying to protect, I do agree with that reframing of the question, because I think that for historically, and this is something interestingly that I've been told. Or I've been lectured about regarding nursing's hard-earned position in healthcare systems and in current decision-making circles, in political arenas as well, with people of power, political leaders, and so on. And it's probably a relationship or, forms of alliances that need to be negotiated and salvaged on a daily basis. And there's certainly, I don't not believe for a second that these are secure and acquired. And I think that there's, in going back to Ismalia's reframing of the question, what is it trying to protect? I think that is one of the things that nursing is trying to protect those alliances that are deemed to be useful or necessary or inevitable for, to secure nursing status or position, to certainly promote and sustain nursing's professional image as well. And that's why we have such lack of engagement with philosophical and political ideas in those upper circles of nursing. And I'll include academia in there as well. And in doctoral programs, as Ismalia was underscoring. And I do think that it's one of those things. I think that there is a relationship there with, biomedicine and all that. And I think that there's also something beyond that. In looking at how, for example, so many nursing organizations were incredibly silent at the height of the pandemic, while nurses are speaking up, going to the media, taking tremendous risks, personal risks, psychological risks, and professional risks, to denounce what was happening, what was going on. And you didn't have a lot of regulatory bodies that were standing up with them at all. And the only way that I can explain that, and I'm happy for anyone to have a counter observation, but the only way that I can explain that is that it did those nursing organizations, that's why I call them so-called nursing leaders, did not want to disrupt and to harm their relationships and their alliances with elected officials. And it made a very clear decision to where it was standing in relation to, and I think that kind of goes back to these issues of, sustaining certain kinds of elitism and privilege and power. And I think that is a big part of that problem that we're seeing in terms of what do we stand for, what do we speak up for, and what do we remain silent on, and how do we sustain silences in other realms as well. I have many more things to say, but I'll stop here so that everybody can kind of jump in and comment as well.
I would like to just say something very quickly about the history, because I feel like, there was a narrative that was created that was based on a lie of what nursing is. Because who was taking care of these communities before Florence Nightingale? And I think that's really the definition of, to me, what nursing was. Unfortunately, I had to learn that history on my own. I didn't learn that during my nursing education. So I feel like there's a whole, this silencing of not really telling and being honest about history still perpetuates harm. And I think if nursing really wants to be the discipline they say they are, we have to uncover that. We have to unpack that. We have to be honest with each other, and we have to all have a space where we can talk about this honestly and openly, and stop the lies, because people are getting harmed. And I'm especially thinking too, Dr. Gullick, you had me thinking a lot about the transgender population, because where is nursing in that area, finding out how to make sure that they're safe when they enter the healthcare system? And I'm specifically looking at the birthing people, transgender birthing people, how they're often left out of nursing knowledge. And I myself looking so that I can improve care myself, looking to the nursing literature and finding one article, one. I felt like I was back in school because I had to look through, I was like, there's something wrong here, I'm missing something. And realizing I wasn't. One nursing article, a few articles by other disciplines, but how do we improve care if the nursing knowledge is not there?
I think that part of the problem is nursing as a profession sometimes just sleepwalks through these social issues. And I think this idea that Dr. Perron noted of just a lack of engagement means that what a sin of omission becomes a sin of oppression, really. And nurses are very good at being caught up in their clinical busyness. And that makes it easier for them not to have to interact with these challenging ideas.
I appreciate you sharing that. Actually, I had some ideas coming into turning my mic on, but just hearing you say that, Dr. Gullick, I think of former nursing students who are now colleagues, some even friends, and those who really want to challenge the white supremacy and colonialism and empire building of nursing are the ones who want to leave nursing. And so I think about that and I carry them with me. I also can't, I'd be remiss to not speak of a diaspora as a Filipino nurse. There's a reason why we are in 50 different countries, right? And so when I think of narratives and history, I think it's an opportunity for us to not just see the work and read and hear the work of historians, oral history, written history, right? But to also see the connections between nursing, medicine, and the military. I think of Lavinia Dock, who went to the Philippines. One of the many steps leading to why we have Filipino nurses in 50 countries. We are more than our potlucks. I just have to say that we are more than our potlucks. We are more than folks who speak, many dialects, maybe at the nurses' stations, making some folks uncomfortable. But I want it to be clear that we live these histories, we feel these histories in our bones across these human-made borders, and there's answerability that's needed, not just let's hire consultants to have a nice Cliff Notes version of equity and diversity and inclusion at the beginning of documents, but not have anything that's operationalized into action that will actually be transformative.
Yeah, thank you, all of you, for your thoughtful engagement here. This puts me in mind of something else, another topic that again comes from Audre Lorde, and this is the title of the essay, The Uses of Anger, which Lorde sees as a powerful tool in the arsenal to combat oppression. And I think we can make the case, right, that emotion is frequently discounted in the macro structures of knowledge production, whether it's being deemed hysterical and thus like not worth attending to, or as an invalid means of knowing people in the structures. I'm thinking here in particular of Dr. Canty's comments about NIH funding. I would be curious to see how they would respond to things like emotion. And so I wonder if any of y'all sort of resonate with this question and have considerations that you might like to offer.
I could start. I just think, and I'm speaking as my experience as a nurse of color, but as a Black nurse, but also my colleagues that are also, mostly nurses of color, is that our emotions, our experiences have value and really help, like we bring a perspective to nursing science that others don't see. And I've been in several situations where I've been silent and still called the angry Black woman. But sometimes it's like when you keep on experiencing these barriers, it's like you're not supposed to be angry. If you give your draft of your doctoral thesis to your advisor and they take 6 months to hand it back, you're not supposed to be angry. If you come in wanting to look at one thing and they tell you, no, don't look at that, look at something else. I feel like we have the right to be angry. We have the right to show emotion, but society wants us to suppress that. But I'm no longer suppressing that because that's an important part of who I am. And I feel like when I have my emotions going, that's when I provide the best nursing care. That's when I provide the best midwifery care. That's what I can really think up, research, and how I want to approach something. It's like I need those emotions, and I'm not going to be silenced anymore. And I hope that other nurses also, like I felt a lot of emotions coming from Claire right now. I got chills. Don't give that up.
Amélie?
And building on that, this resonates, Dr. Canty, because this is something that we've even in my department, we had some unfortunate incidents and exchanges involving students of color challenging our department and our university more broadly about some of the practices, exclusionary practices, discriminatory practices that were taking place. And one of the things that was said about these students standing up for themselves and their rights was that, they had some points. However, it was unfortunate how they went about it in terms of their tone and in terms of their exactly like what you were saying, like, the emotions that they used and that fueled their what they were asking for and what they were trying to express to the school. And it was fascinating to some of us watching the very unproblematic comfort of some colleagues not thinking twice about the power differential between these students and students of color against, a white academic, very privileged system of thought. And just focusing on just focusing on the tone rather than the message and the crucial implications of what these students were telling us, and using that as an excuse to dismiss or to minimize the importance of the message and what it required of us as those very privileged, safe, secure academics, what it required of us in challenging our thinking, challenging how we were doing things, how we were speaking to students and how we were engaging with them and being sensitive to their needs, broader than just them succeeding in this course or that course, but succeeding in graduate programs more broadly. And it was, again, the use, the weaponization of emotions, using that to as an excuse so that we don't have to leave our comfort zone. And it's very much in keeping with that expectation that, as nurses, we should know better. We're supposed to be professional. We're supposed to be polite and courteous. You're allowed to feel things, but, keep it to yourself and just make sure that your message is neutral. Make sure that it's not too disruptive. And for me to have that sort of message perpetuated by people who should know far more better, and who for whom it should be safe to know and to engage in change is incredibly disheartening. And I can't even imagine seeing that as a white privileged person, not even being able to imagine what it's like if you are a person of color who has had to evolve in that sort of of thinking and weaponization. But it plays out absolutely every single day. And it's a very useful weapon to make sure that people who speak, quote unquote, too loud or not in the right manner are going to be put back in their place so that we don't have to listen to them as much as we should.
Claire, go.
Okay, I'll do brief. Thank you. Dr. Gullick, when you said benign tolerance, there's an interesting way that I have found emotion to be tolerated, and that's when folks choose to hear but not listen, and they respond by saying, "You are so passionate." And that has become a pet peeve. And I don't mean that in a superficial way. It's a way to not be heard and to be dismissed and to say, there's no intellectual grounding here. There's no need for me to be curious. You are just so passionate. And so that's all I wanted to say to that.
Dr. Gullick, please go ahead.
I was glad that you drew me to the work of Audre Lorde, and the way that she spoke about anger is that it's not the anger that will destroy us, but our refusals to stand still and listen to its rhythms and to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance, and tap that anger as an important source of empowerment. And so I think that's a fabulous way to think about the power of anger. I also wonder, though, I was really drawn to Dr. D'Souza's point about inclusionary othering, and made me really think critically about, wow, how do I go about bringing this into curriculum or bringing it into scholarly work without it having that appearance? And I wonder if, along with anger, we can have celebration and finding ways to not only talk about the disadvantages, but to talk about the strengths, and whether that balance between recognizing the disempowerment, but also the empowerment, allows us to normalize people who are living as marginalized people.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, joy can be resistance, right? Celebration, power. I have a feeling that I could continue to ask all the questions that I have, and we could fill all of our time together. And I am going to conclude selfishly, because I am the moderator here. I have one last question I want to ask everybody, and then I'm going to open the remarks or the questions and answers to the audience. And my last question is, as we have this conversation together, what do you dream of? What could be?
I just dream of being in a space where I could just be free, that I can be my authentic self in nursing, and that I can be respected. I just dream of a space where I can collaborate with my colleagues or not be invited to the team, not because I'm Black, but because I'm a nursing scholar and I have something to contribute, something that's valuable. So that's part of my dream. I can go on and on. I just dream of safe spaces for us to exist in nursing.
I would say I dream of a future where my mixed kids don't have to wonder about their identity, where they will always feel at home. And I dream of a future where comrades, kasamas, storytellers, truth tellers are not hunted and not targeted, and maybe don't even have to do the work of carrying liberation on their shoulders.
Ismalia?
I dream of a day that nursing has achieved a new praxis of being, a new praxis of seeing the other, where we see the person standing next to us as very much as like us. And I'm reminded here of the words of Chicana feminism, feminist Gloria Zaldúa, todos somos nosotras. That's what I dream of.
I can add to that in that I dream of a space and a time where there's no longer a need to step on others to elevate oneself. And I sometimes get asked, what would be a good solution? What would be a good fix? What should we do implement? And I always want to be careful, because in true Foucauldian fashion, whatever system we replace is going to be replaced with another system that's going to come with its own power relationships. And sometimes those will get harder and harder to see and harder to tease out, and their effects, their harms might be harder and harder to identify. I just hope that we never lose the momentum and the curiosity to ask and to probe, and to turn those questions inwards as well, to challenge what's out there and to challenge ourselves as well as nurses and as citizens in a broader system, and to never become too satisfied and too complacent with whatever improvements we think we have achieved, and that we never feel too secure about that, because I think that's when you start letting your guard down, and this is where you create other problems, other issues, and other harms. And I hope that we don't lose sight of that.
I dream of a time where some of these discussions, because younger people are bringing different ways of viewing the world, some of these elements of bigotry may be rendered irrelevant. And in discussing some issues of sexual diversity and gender diversity with my beautiful gay son, he said, "Mum, I know this is a thing for your generation, but it's just not an issue for us." And I know that that's not universal, but I'm hoping that that some of our bigotry may in time become, bigots may become irrelevant.
I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart, with lots of love, right? Another emotion that maybe doesn't get validated as much as it ought in the Academy. I really appreciate the insight and generosity of your discussions today. And with that, would be happy to, if y'all are, field some questions. So as a reminder, people who would like to ask questions in the room need to come up to the mics, and folks on the Zoom, in Zoom land, need to put their hands up so that we can tell that you're interested in asking a question.
I'm not sure if somebody had their hand.
Please go ahead, and then Rochelle will go to you after this question.
Oh, is this on? Okay. I think thank you the panel. I think this was wonderful. This was really just, I have no words for it. It was really mind blowing. So, but my question is more for is it Ismalia? Is that? So I think one thing, I know you're a PhD student, and I'm really glad to see that somebody is bringing Chicana feminism into their work, and not only that, applying it to a global lens. So that's very, coming from the borderlands that she speaks of. I really think that's, that really is amazing. Anyway, so I think my question falls around that, the expansion of what Anzaldúa was saying in Borderlands, right? She talks about the third space. She operationalizes it. She talks about, this Borderlands, right, being a queer and Chicana space. My question here, and this is more of a challenge, I guess, not so much of a question, but, we're living now a couple of generations past her work, right? 1 or 2 generations since. It looks like her work, is foundational still and very applicable. But however, when we look at that translation over what I call praxis, right, we're starting to not really see what I would consider, and excuse me for my privileged position, but the intended effect, right? I mean, one thing is, though, it's that in these spaces, specifically the ones she says that, the borderlands, right? We're standing in California. I come from Texas, I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. Adrian Juarez here from the University of Texas at Medical Branch. But going back to my to my comment is that, this third space, right? I think we're living in it, right? California, and not only that, but definitely Texas, where you see some of these marginalized people now becoming the majority, right? We're seeing a big demographic shift here in the Southwest. Now, however, though, it seems like these spaces, right? Sure, we're seeing the political power of these people that Anzaldúa talks about, right? The brown folk, right? We've made a lot of gains, right, politically, and not only that, but culturally, right? I mean, you can't go 10 feet out without understanding, and anyone who's not part of the majority culture now can really see, that the Mexicans are still here, right? Now, that said, though, and again, I don't mean to be facetious, so please excuse my lightheartedness, but the thing is, though, is that, however, we've made all these gains here, but yet it seems like we're just perpetuating the settler colonialism, right? When you look at it, I mean, the outcome is what? California has really no more middle class, right? Texas has become even more oppressive and more, segregated. Now, I guess the question now is that how do we change? Do we orientate ourselves? Is it time for maybe not leaving behind the foundational work, but maybe finding a different framing for it? And I say this just because I think when you want to translate that action, what I call the praxis, right? What direction do we go to? Because we've made achievements, but really, realistically, now realistically, in your perspective, is there this change, right? This third space that she spoke about, and was almost utopian in nature, right? And I don't mean that in any way of a critique. I mean it as this is what she was really talking about, where the Chicanekis people can really be who they are, right? Be connected to the ground that was originally theirs. And by no means do I think any ownership of anybody's land is ridiculous, right? I think just a little soapbox side note there. I really think
Ismalia,
the original peoples,
I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, please interrupt me at any time. So, because I do get long-winded. But anyway, so I'm just, I guess, to just wrap it up. What do you think? I mean, you've taken this fountain of knowledge, right, and you've applied it to a global lens. Now, maybe what we're in need of is a refresher, or maybe a renewed focus or reorientation, right? And I just want to, I guess my question now comes to you. What do you think about all that? We've seen what this dream was, right? The borderlands, right? This utopia, the Aslanan utopian.
I think this is a really wonderful, I think this is probably a question that expands the boundaries of what we've been talking about. And certainly we're fortunate to have time afterwards too, where we can maybe engage around this. Ismalia, do you have thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Adrian, and for the comments. Perhaps I want to come back to something that you mentioned around that we have engaged with Chicana feminism, because I don't agree with that. I don't think that all of us have done that. For sure, I discovered Chicana feminism by, I'm going to be honest, actually, it was Dr. Claire Valderama-Wallace that posted something on Twitter about Gloria Anzaldúa in a series of books, and that's how I discovered Chicana feminism. So I don't think nursing has engaged with Chicana feminism at the outset. And I think there's many reasons why it has not engaged with Chicana feminism. If you look at English nursing journals, you probably will find one article that has talked about Chicana feminism, that has used Chicana feminism, but never at a philosophical level. So I'm respectively going to push back on whether nursing has engaged with that. I don't think we have engaged with Chicana feminism, and so I don't think that we I think we are yet to see the possibilities of Chicana feminism. And again, I don't claim to be a Chicana, but I do think that there are important ontological and epistemological goodness in Chicana feminism that I think nursing needs to adopt. And I'm going to leave it as that because I'm also conscious of the time. But the answer for me is that I don't think nursing has engaged with Chicana feminism and the possibilities of this kind of thought.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Twitter has honestly how I connected with at least a couple people who are in this space right now over the course of the pandemic, including you. So Rochelle, you had your hand up and I wondered if you wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to all the panelists too for such an enriching discussion. I wanted to pick up on a point of Dr. De Sousa's actually, but also that I heard threaded through all of the speakers today was around this turning the lens. And I think Dr. De Sousa did that specifically, is what has nursing got to give up, or what are we protecting in nursing in order to engage, to continue this kind of way of being. And it made me again think, we're citing Audre Lorde from many angles here, but it made me think of the paper, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about responses and very much appreciated Amelie's discussion and Dr. Perron's discussion of the responses also coming with their own tensions and issues, and as we kind of move through. But I wanted to kind of ask the speakers really about this idea of what is nursing protecting and how do we move that? Because I think it's also, I think we have such struggles in nursing in part also because of our kind of midway oppressed position as nursing. So because of the kinds of ways that we've ascribed to power in the past is us aligning with the masters, aligning with biomedical ideas, aligning with, in order for credibility. And I certainly see that in our funding currently and our, our education, picking up on Dr. Canty's point, and all kinds of, so I would like to hear from people about what you think we're protecting and how we can start to kind of rattle that a bit or shift it a bit.
Dr. Gullick, please.
I wonder if what we're protecting, if I'm thinking about the development of nurses and courses that are often accredited by nursing bodies and needing to include particular types of knowledge, some of which is sociological, but much of which is clinical. And I think that privileging of clinical knowledge, stuff about people's bodies, over bodies in the world. And I think this is something that we need to fight for space in curriculum and see knowledges of people's way of being in the world as part of clinical knowledge and part of nursing practice.
I would add that nursing protects a claim to status. I think about the discourse of professionalism. And I would say, imagine if we were working alongside and following the leadership of folks who know what their own solutions are. And I don't even like saying the word there because that the discourse of nursing versus community, or anytime in nursing we use the word community, who are we really talking about? So that's a whole thing. But if we were to look at La Vida Campesina or Anti-Police Terror Project or International Women's Alliance, what are movement leaders telling us? And I'm not saying we're completely separate. There are nurses who are organizers, right? So imagine if we were to challenge the class line and ableist line, et cetera, a patriarchal heteronormative line of nursing and say, we are going to work alongside folks. Folks are building and they're doing. we're waiting for instructions. So
Amélie, please go ahead.
So Rochelle's question, or Dr. Boden's question, kind of like revisiting this this idea and this notion of who or what are we trying to protect, and saying certainly trying to protect certain types of conventions and what I would call sacred cows in nursing, because we have quite a bunch of those, and they're incredibly secure and difficult to disrupt and displace. But going back to, you know, this idea of privileged ways of knowing, there's this notion of, you know, epistocracy, you know, that some people promote the idea that the world should be run not through democracy but epistocracy. This idea that there should be a rule by those who know, and I think that when we look at, you know, this idea of those who know, and never questioning what they actually know or what they purport to be knowledge, how this knowledge was acquired at the expense of what other types of knowledges, that doesn't really come into question. It's this idea that there's kind of like an elite who knows better than the rest, and those are the people who should make all the decisions, and this is where power should be concentrated. And thinking back to, you know, nursing's own positioning and its daily efforts to maintain and safeguard and protect this positioning. And certainly, you know, the efforts that went into that in terms of, like, you know, patriarchal systems and so on, but never really touching on the colonial systems of knowledge. I think that I wonder sometimes if, and this is going to sound very harsh, but I think I can't word it any other way. I sometimes wonder to what extent nursing as a profession has the maturity to fully engage in those reflections and come to grips with the learnings that occur when we sincerely and authentically engage in those discussions. Wondering about the kind of knowledge that we say we were often talking about nursing expertise and knowledge and skills and all that. Of course, always sidestepping the ignorance part of it, the things that we prefer not to know, that we don't know, that we can't know, that we are made not to know, and so on and so on. And I find that there's still a very strong reluctance to really delve into these questions, as uncomfortable as they can be. And especially speaking from an academic perspective, where I'm supposed to be right smack in the middle of these privileged systems of knowledge. I have benefited from these, and I will continue to benefit from these. And at the same time, I think that it requires, I think maybe this is the biggest challenge that we have as a profession, is to tackle these issues of knowledge and challenging ourselves into thinking in letting go of things, and having faith that this is going to push us on towards something that we don't yet know, but that is worth knowing nonetheless. You know, it's what I was referring to before. Right now, the system isn't perfect, but it's better than nothing. Or, like, you know, and being scared of what we don't know yet. And instead of thinking, well, how can we shape this yet to be defined future, and seeing a role for ourselves in that regard, that can be a lot more inclusive, a lot more supportive and safe and inclusionary, and seeing potential in that, as opposed to staying in the comforts of what we know now, because, well, it served us, or at least it served some of us pretty well, and maybe that's good enough for now. That might be the biggest question that besets us right now.
Yeah, and I'm going to just kind of piggyback off of that. I think that nursing doesn't really know what is protecting. I think that there's a lot of things that are not true that we've been told, that we've been educated about. And I think there's a fear in really looking at that, because we're afraid of what we're going to see, because so many of us have benefited off of this system. And I always think about the patients who were harmed, the communities that were harmed, the nurses of color who were harmed. So I always think of that. And also just, you know, other people who are oppressed, how there's been so much harm. But what we have to do on an individual level is look at where we're at. And it's scary to think about, I participated in that. And I'll just share this very quickly to put into perspective what I'm saying is that I was new to academia. I was trying to learn. I felt good in it. And I felt like I found my purpose. But I also found that I was voting on policies and procedures that caused harm to students who look like me. And I remember there was a policy that impacted several students being kicked out of a nursing program who were 2 or 3 points below where they needed to be. Some kicked out, some would have to repeat a whole year. And when I got off the elevator, and again, I'm in the meetings, we're talking about these students, but when I got off the elevator and I saw it with my own eyes, the students lined up to talk to their professor so that they could appeal. I couldn't blame everybody else. I couldn't blame the system. I couldn't blame the policy without looking at myself first, because I became a part of the system too. And my awareness, and it was painful. It wasn't like I found out I'm part of the system and now I'm going to go out and have fun with my family. It was that I found out that I was part of the system and I became physically sick. And I had a decision to make. Are you going to continue to perpetuate what's already being done, or are you going to stand up? And I chose to stand up. I was scared to death, I'm not going to lie, but I stood up and all those students were allowed to progress. All of them. There was nobody was excluded from that. And these students all graduated on time. They all passed their NCLEX the first time. And, I was thinking of who's determining who can be a nurse, who has the skills to be a nurse scholar. And again, I think that is built on false beliefs that cause harm. But we have to look at ourselves individually, then we look at the systems that we're in. Things aren't going to change unless we do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Canty. That's the final word. And I think now can adjourn to the common area or I'll turn it over to Miriam to say what comes next.
So you were doing great. Okay. So yes, this formally, thank you, Lucinda. This formally ends the today's events from conference perspective, and we will all slowly gather our things and move over to the right, to the patio outside, and have some cocktails and some music and discussion, and hopefully we can continue what we've just been talking about. All right, thank you.
Panel, don't leave. Can I hold Amélie and Janice and Ismalia for just a minute? Okay.
Nobody.
Josh. Thank you. Okay, somebody's going to take a picture of us. Panelists, so smile or don't. Do what feels right to you. Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment and again express my appreciation for all of you for taking the time to be here today and to engage in this series of questions. I sincerely appreciate it and just have so much generative and joyful spinning to think about. So thank you.